So, no matter who you are or where you are in your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. So, take a deep breath or two or four. Just be here. May grace be in our heads and in our thinking. Grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. Grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in my mouth and in my speaking. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. And may we, because of what we do here, grow in patience, tolerance, kindness, and love. So today, I want to make a prediction about the outcome of the presidential election. I begin this by telling a story. One night, while a man was quietly going about his business, he heard a voice from above. The voice came down and said, "Jesus is watching you." Needless to say, he was scared witless. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before. He was not a religious person. His parents made him go to church when he was younger, but he had gotten over that. He proceeded, and once again the voice came down from above and said, "Jesus is watching you." Now, it might interest you to know that this man's business is that of being a house burglar. He's good at it. He has managed to gain access to a house in River Oaks while the people are away there in Aspen skiing. He's bypassed the security system, found the wall safe, hidden behind the painting of the grandfather who made all this wealth possible. He's cracked the safe and is about to open it when he hears this voice. "Jesus is watching you." He shines his flashlight around, resumes his work. He's about to remove the contents of the safe, jewels, money, gold bars, when again he hears this voice coming down. "Jesus is watching you." He shines his light up, and there, sitting on one of the wooden beams in the vaulted ceiling of this man cave in this River Oaks mansion, is a parrot. And the parrot again says, "Jesus is watching you." The burglar, quite a sophisticated person, you can tell by the kind of house he burgles, says, "Only a parrot. You don't scare me." The parrot turned his head, and the beam of the burglar's flashlight followed to where the parrot looked, and the light fell on the most ferocious-looking Doberman God had ever made. The burglar froze, and the parrot said, "Sick him, Jesus." Jesus is watching us, you. Now, some people hear that phrase like the burglar, and it's terrifying. And some hear it as comforting. And for others, it's absolutely inconsequential. So today, before giving my prediction, I want to teach some about Jesus. And not only who he was, but who he might be for us. And my goal in offering this teaching is that though it might be initially uncomfortable, that we end up being comforted. Okay. Then I'll get to my prediction about the election. First of all, a small detour. As you know, I'm fascinated by word phrases and origins, thanks to my mom. And these are illustrative of things that I think are useful to us. The phrase "sickle" is first found in a book called Arizona Nights, which is published in 1845. But the word sleuths are fairly convinced that this phrase came from an English hunting prayer that was made prior to the time when they went out for the hunt, and it was a prayer over the dogs that the dogs may seek them out. So seek them became sick 'em. So when I grew up, I was convinced that that piece of furniture in the bedroom was a chest of drawers. Now, as for the image of the parrot that I showed, it isn't a parrot. It's not a parrot, it's a person. So there's a body artist by the name of Johanna Stotter who does series of art like this with breathable paint on models. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. For this is the artist's face here, and this is the model's face over there. It's like one of those optical illusions. Once you see it, you can't unsee it again. Things are not always as they appear, are they? So both of these items, sick 'em and seeing what is instead of what you think is there, is illustrative of the value of thinking outside the box. Because if we don't learn to do this, we risk getting the same outcomes we've been getting. When it comes to religion and spirituality, that's especially true. However, there's that very potent theological word again. However, when it comes to religion and spirituality, we only really get to go outside the box once we've been willing to go deep inside the box. And that box is a box of justice and compassion, which is where I hope we end up today, so that we can leave this time today open to experience and then express who Jesus was and what he taught. So, a bit of a teaching about Jesus and then about the election. But before the election, something about not only who Jesus was, but what he taught, and then its application for us, okay? Just this week, I had someone ask me a question that I've been asked frequently over the last 40 years. And that is, especially after I started teaching about the Jesus of history, why haven't I heard this before? Especially people who've been going to church all their lives, have not been exposed to teachings about the historical Jesus or the origin of the Gospels and the sayings of Jesus. Well, here's a partial answer to that. We could spend weeks doing this, but you remember last week I said that there was a theological controversy that broke out about 1919 that divided religious scholars into two camps. There were the modernists, progressives, or liberals on one side, and the people who came to be known as the fundamentalists or the radical conservatives on the other side. The word fundamentalism did not get applied to Christian religious beliefs until sometime early in this, what turned out to be about a 30-year battle between the conservatives and the moderates. And sometime early in that period, the word fundamentalism got applied to some religious groups. Now, at that time, early 1900s, there were a lot of changes going on in this country. Part of this is what we're going to talk about next week. But just like there are changes going on now, social changes, cultural changes, educational changes, religious changes, ethnic changes, economic changes, Um, Darwin's work was becoming known in the United States about that time. It was about that time that scholarly work being done by German scholars in biblical studies were beginning to make their way to the United States. There was an influx of Roman Catholics into the United States during that time, particularly immigrants from Ireland and Southern Europe. There was an emphasis on building a just society for working people. And these changes were seen especially by the conservative religious leaders as secular and humanist and therefore not Christian. And so they began to fight them. There were new movements that were also starting up in this country. Christian Scientism, New Age philosophy, New Ageism, Mary Baker Eddy and her work, Mormonism was beginning to take root. And so many of these conservative people looked at these changes with disgust and fear. They said they were cultish and they wanted to fight them. Now you might wonder, who were these people on the far right? Well, just like today, they are the ones that had the biggest megaphones. Liberals, for the most part, have been way too kind, considerate, and I know there are exceptions on both sides, but in this case, they were Protestant clergy, and they were associated at that time with the ultra-conservative religious movement that came out of Princeton Theological Seminary at that time. That would no longer be true today. Now, these are deeply devout people, but they were not very learned. They were not very educated. At the same time, there were religious scholars at places like Union Theological Seminary, Harvard Divinity School, Yale Divinity School, Chicago Divinity School, who were incorporating these new insights that were coming in biblical studies into their curriculum that they were teaching their students. So the reputation that the ones on the left got was that they were religious liberals who were no longer bound by Christian core principles. Now, in response to this, the conservatives became even more aggressive, defending their position. And the one position that they really went for was defending the literal nature of the Bible. Now, in their minds, they were engaged in a fight for God against infidels. And they were going to fight these enemies. They saw the liberals as enemies of the truth. They had the truth and they were going to fight. And the weapon that they used for this fight was a series of tracts, little pamphlets, that were written, designed to spell out in clear detail the fundamental and irreducible core beliefs of what they call Orthodox Christianity. Now, for some reason, these pamphlets caught the attention of some rich oil people in California. It almost, is what's happening today. And these rich oil people funded sending 30,000 of these pamphlets every week to every church in America for weeks and weeks and weeks. Now, I said 30,000. I'm sorry, there were 300,000. Later, the company that was responsible for this got all these tracts together and put them in a book, which I don't have, but I've never been able to locate it. It was a massive propaganda operation, and it worked. Those who supported this movement were called, because these books were the fundamentals, they were called the fundamentalists. And those opposed to this movement were called at that time the modernists. And at that time in American history, fundamentalists made up the majority of Protestant churches in America. Now just think about that. The majority of Protestant churches in America. Okay. They also oppose voting rights for women, women's emancipation. They defended segregation. They defended capital punishment. It was actually a Baptist. You know, anytime something really stupid comes down the pike, have you noticed it's either a Baptist or a Texan that's... So it was actually an editor of a Baptist paper. They used to be very popular, whose name was Curtis Lee Laws, who in 1920 applied the word fundamentalist as a good thing to these people, saying they were doing battles over the fundamentals. So the battle between the fundamentalist and the modernist went on for 30 years. Maybe it still is, in another form. The modernist won the major metropolitan areas and most all the institutions of higher education. Got that? The fundamentalist won all the churches in the South and all the rural churches. That's a lot. The more sophisticated fundamentalists began calling themselves evangelicals because they wanted to avoid some of the extremisms of the fundamentalist movement, which is ironic now because the evangelical movement has been completely taken over by Christian nationalism in our time. So it was that evangelical Christianity thrived, and they taught the fundamentals, sometimes in a velvet glove, sometimes not. But that movement shaped the education, the laity education program of every Protestant church in America. There were few exceptions. Disciples of Christ, Unitarian, but every church, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Congregational, you name it, they were. Our curriculum is still influenced by this agenda. So that any change in the intellectual revolution that's occurred in the last 500 years has not made it in the church, especially in the last 200 years. And it is ironic to me that many of these churches proclaim that they are open for everyone, but they embrace a theological position that excludes. Now, I don't know about you, but my personal experience is that I cannot have an honest, open conversation with a fundamentalist. I have tried. And every time I have brought up something or someone to quote, Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, some theologian from Germany, I have been dismissed, belittled, it has felt like, and offered things like, well, that person's not really a Christian. I remember after reading Battle for God and the History of God by Karen Armstrong, mentioning that to someone, she's really a top-level scholar who has written, and the comment I got from this fundamentalist was, oh, you mean that angry nun? Just wiped it away that way. You can't trust so-and-so. He's a member of the Jesus Seminar, and on it goes. Fundamentalists always have an enemy. This is true in any religion. Islam, Mormonism, whatever, if you're to the far right, you have an enemy. And in Christianity, in our time, that enemy has been the homosexual. Go figure. That's the issue that split the United Methodist Church. It split other churches as well. And in addition, sadly, though they try to disguise it, what really is their issue is white nationalism. Now, they disguised that, and they knew, if you've seen any documentary on the rise of the right, this is not original with me, I'm just summarizing some of this material. They knew that they could not sell white nationalism as a voting issue. So the one they went for was anti-abortion, because they knew that would sell, although it may not. We'll see. At any rate, these tracts that were printed between 1909 and 1915, they eventually reduced to 5 points. And these are the fundamentals of fundamentalism. The first one is the Bible is the literal, inerrant Word of God. Now, a biblical scholar who studies statistics on these matters says that easily 50% of all the people in this country who call themselves Christian believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. Now, if in any other literature any of these people read a story about a talking snake and a tree that had all knowledge in a magical garden, they would dismiss this as myth. But if it's in the Bible, it must be true. The next one is Jesus was literally born of a virgin. The next one, substitutionary atonement, is the meaning of Jesus' death on the cross. The word atonement, the word atone, is a contraction of two words at one. So that if atonement means to be made one with. That's what that means. I have said maybe 100 times, this is the most successful bad theology ever written. The next one is the miracles of the New Testament are real. They really happened. Jesus turned water into wine, multiplied bread, walked on water. And of course, the big one, Jesus arose physically from the grave. He ascended literally into the sky, and he will return someday in the second coming. Shelby Spong said that if Jesus ascended 50 days at Pentecost and left the earth at the speed of light, he would still be in our galaxy. Every fight within American Christianity comes from these roots. Evolution versus intelligent design, birth control, abortion, women's equality, homosexuality, the Bible. They finally all come down to expanding knowledge or holding on to these. Fundamentalism in any religion is not only dangerous, but always violent. Sometimes that violence comes in a velvet glove, but it's violent. I want to be clear, and you can quote me on this. These teachings are fraudulent, they are dangerous, and they are damaging. They are damaging to people's spiritual growth and an insult to your intelligence. Now, there is absolutely no way to grow up in American culture without having some awareness of Jesus. For one thing, the two biggest holidays in America are Christmas and Easter. And now we've got the rise of Christian nationalism and everything in between, all the way from the television series The Chosen. Seen that? Actually, it's not bad. Trump selling made-in-China Bibles. People carrying signs on January 6th into the Capitol saying, Jesus is my Savior, Trump is my president. Carrying crosses and Bibles and on and on and on. people get a notion of Jesus. Now, in the period of my life when I believed in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, Jesus was God. Or same as. Further, the God that Jesus was son of was not a very nice God. Oh, sure, I got told God loves you, but that was under certain circumstances, which I could never be really clear on. And if I didn't get clear about those, this God of love would delightfully burn me in hell forever. It took me decades to get over that and to begin to appreciate and then embrace the utterly remarkable human being that Jesus was. You hear that statement, what I just made? Even now, to say that statement without adding something about his also being divine makes people feel uncomfortable. Fact is that when you deprive Jesus of his humanity, you deprive him of his greatness. Now, in Christianity, the classical and traditional, underline exclamation point, is that Jesus in his life and teaching shows us what a life full of God looks like. Now, related to this is what's God like? And again, it's impossible for a human not to have some understanding and belief about what the word God points to. Good or bad, right or wrong, everybody's got some notion. Now, the character of the God I grew up hearing about and thus believing in was a God of judgment and a God who is angry. The God of Jesus is a God of compassion and justice. Now, those two words, compassion and justice, need to become far more prominent in our thinking and behavior. So what can we say about Jesus? Well, the first and most prominent thing to be said about Jesus is that he was a Jewish mystic. Now, a mystic is someone who knows. Most of us are in the category of thinking we know. There's a difference between knowing and thinking you know. For Jesus, God was not an idea. God was an experiential reality. And to quote Jim Finley, I only am saying that I'm just letting you know, I know I'm repeating myself. To quote Jim Finley again, Jim Finley says, if you close your eyes and you went into a deep meditation so that when you open your eyes, you would see the world as Jesus saw it, what would you see? And Finley says, when you open your eyes, you would see God. Because Jesus saw God in everything and in everyone. The next thing I would say is that Jesus is a wisdom teacher. And though many of his teachings are so strikingly original and memorable, that we're still mulling them over. He drew his teachings from his Jewish religion in the hope of reforming that religion. He taught a way to live, and it was a way that led beyond conventional wisdom. And it was not only a different way, but it was a narrow way. It was a hard way. And it was a subversive way. It offered an alternative way of understanding things. And the third thing that I would say about Jesus is that he was a social prophet. He was a Jewish mystic in the wisdom tradition of the Hebrew prophets, who also had a vivid experience of God, and out of their experience of God, they became strong voices against the domination system that took advantage of the already poor. You may see some parallels between then and our society. These political systems were legitimized by the religion of their time, and it was for his social passion that Jesus was executed. He did not die for your sins. I know you're pretty sinful, just like me, but that was not the first function of his death. So there was to Jesus a spirit dimension, a wisdom dimension, and a justice dimension. Now, what would it mean? How would it look for someone to take all this seriously? What would a life full of God look like? Well, using the descriptive terms for understanding Jesus, it would first of all be a life lived in relation to the same Spirit Jesus knew in his own experience. This means that this life would not be very much about beliefs, and it would certainly not be about believing something now in order to get something later. It would not be a belief that was designed to separate you from others or to make you better than others. Spirituality is about becoming conscious of our already existing relationship to the sacred. Or, as I would put it using the metaphor I've been using all year, it's becoming aware that we are already in the sacred stream. You don't have to go anywhere to get to God. God is here. We are in God. It's a matter of raising our awareness to that. Spirituality is not, however, just about awareness. It's about intentionality. I undertake having this awareness with intention, which means that I have some sort of conscious, deliberate, daily spiritual practice. It's the same with anything you love. If I'm going to learn magic tricks, I have to spend time with them. If Sherry's going to know I love her, I have to spend time with her. Another thing such a life would be is it would be a life lived by the alternative wisdom of Jesus. I got that phrase from Marcus Borg. Borg was a living authority on the historic Jesus before he died a few years ago, and he spoke in this room several times. He was a member of the Jesus Seminar. I had the privilege of meeting and talking with him. He was such an incredibly introverted human being, but wonderful, wonderful lecturer. Most people, especially fundamentalists and Christian nationalists, I'm not meaning to be judgmental, but just descriptive. And likely most of us, most of the time, do not live by this alternative wisdom. We live by conventional wisdom. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about the pros and cons of conventional wisdom. Two of the biggest liabilities are, first of all, conventional wisdom blinds us to wonder. One of the reasons I call this gathering Ordinary Life was to get at this very thing. It is in what we take as ordinary that the miraculous lives and is to be found. When it comes to religion, conventional wisdom blinds people with certitude. I had a person I'm companioning in spiritual direction this week ask me a great question. The question was, what major thing have you changed your mind about spiritually and religiously in the last 5 years? That's a great question. Because if you haven't, you're not growing, in my opinion. Certitude blinds us to mystery. It blinds us to wonder. Another thing that conventional wisdom can do is seduce us into listening to it about how to live our lives. You need this, you need to look like this, etc., etc., etc. Jesus is always showing people that you got to die to that and be raised to another way of life. Read the Gospels. It's in there over and over and over. He's not talking about physical death. He's talking about dying to a way of thinking and being raised to another way. So what Jesus did was stress two things in his teaching that conventional wisdom can both blind us to and lead us away from, and that is living with compassion and ignoring justice. Now, when I'm talking about justice, I'm not talking about criminal justice, though that needs to be addressed in our time. I'm talking about social justice. Why was Jesus concerned about social justice? Because the sacred that transformed Jesus was all about compassion. And compassion is aware of human suffering, and the human suffering that is caused by systems. American individualism and the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and social media has created so much isolation among us that we're not aware of our brothers and sisters. Nor are we aware of the extent of injustice that the system inflicts on people. So taking Jesus seriously means raising our own consciousness about the enormous suffering that has been caused and is being caused by the system. It is the system where elites prosper, and more often than not, they prosper at the expense of those who are kept in positions of servitude. If you want to find a simple one-line reason why Christian nationalism and the right has risen so much, it was in that sentence I just said. I'll say it again. The system where elites prosper at the expense of others is what has caused people to feel like they don't have a fair chance, they need somebody to speak for them, and they will go for anybody who can promise them that they will do that. We've all participated in that system. Now, there's a lot of stuff in this to unpack, and if in doing that will be helpful in the days ahead, if you want to know more about fundamentalism or anything else, you can let me know, and I will do it. One shorthand way of saying all this is that if we want to claim that we're Christian in any shape, form, or fashion, that we are following Jesus, we need to hear from time to time, Jesus is watching you. You know, that's a metaphor. But if the values of justice and compassion are not at play in our thinking, we just go about business as usual. Okay. Here's my prediction about the outcome of the election. And I'm wagering $60 that I'm right. $60 is the price of a Trump Bible. First of all, and this is not part of the wager. First of all, regardless of how this election comes out, it isn't going to settle anything. Don't live with that myth. We are still a horribly divided country, and we will be after the election. So here's my prediction. It takes a while to get to it, but you know how most of us look back on 9/11, if you were alive at 9/11. You remember that? After 9/11, we had the sympathy and empathy of the entire world. But our government wanted a war. And now we know, without doubt, that our government lied to us about that War. Colin Powell, in his autobiography, he was Secretary of the State at the time, went before the United Nations and said multiple times that we needed to wage this war because Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. He later wrote that he knew at the time there was no credible evidence of that. He did it because he's quoting George Bush as saying, this is a quote, "You're the only one the American people will trust." He later wrote that doing that was something he deeply regretted, and it is a blot on my career. So the war of shock and awe that was last 3 days, remember? They'll greet us with hallelujahs, welcome arms, remember? Lasted 9 years, over 9 years. And now, most of us look back on that decision as a squandered opportunity, right? Most of us look back on how, when our European ancestors came to this country, they stole land, killed people to get land from people who were already here. How time after time after time we have broken treaties that we have made just so that we could have more. Tried to wipe the identity out of Native American children, change their names. You know how most of us know that it was so brutally wrong for some person or persons to come up with the idea of taking other people from their country, putting them in ships and bringing them here and selling them as things? Now we look back on that with shame. That we planted karmic seeds there that we are still reaping and have yet to come to terms with. By the way, those two events that I just mentioned, I don't know about the war in Iraq, but those two events, stealing land from Native American people and enslaving people, are now being written out of the textbooks that our children are reading about American history because, as someone has put it, we don't want to make them feel bad. So on Tuesday, this country will elect our next president. And though I think it is not likely that we'll know the outcome until much later, maybe Friday, maybe by next Sunday we'll know. Here's my prediction. Regardless of who is elected president, someday, some historian is going to look back on this time in American history like we look back on those three events I just mentioned, with great shame and guilt. I'm not picking a party. I'm just saying that the country has gotten in a place that is embarrassing. I know loyal Republicans, friends of mine, who tell me they're going to vote for Trump and hold their nose. Andy Borowitz says that his new parenting strategy is to say to his children, ask what Trump would do and do the opposite. That's sad. That we ever got as a country to be in a position to be this divided. That a person who, were he of color or not wealth, would already be in prison, is for whatever reason the head of a party, a role model for children, and a national embarrassment. I personally thought that the Access Hollywood tape would shut this train wreck down. I was wrong. Nothing seems to. Even threatening Liz Cheney with a firing squad. That's just what you do. It's where we've become. Our situation, among other things, is that our media, left and right, has been more concerned with making money for their sponsors than informing the public. That racism has raised its ugly head. Threats of violence are already being made and enacted. The comments veiled as jokes which are not, are made that would have been unthinkable just a few short years ago. That political preferences have divided families, made conversations impossible. All of this and more is our current embarrassment. This is not a proud time in our life together. And my prediction is that at some point in the future, some historian, maybe not even of this country, will look back on this time and see how we squandered our trust in each other, our values of honesty and integrity for something else. John Dominic Crossan said, the prophets of the Hebrew tradition were not being threatening when they made their pronouncements. They were just being descriptive. He said, if sometime when the traffic is not heavy, you pitch your tent in the middle of I-45, don't be upset when you get run over by an 18-wheel truck the next day. One of the things I did to prepare for this time today was to watch a movie. The movie came out a couple of years ago, and it's classified as a comedy, sci-fi film. I saw it when it first came out, and I thought then, though it has some really hilarious moments, it's really closer to a horror film or a documentary about a horror film. The movie is called Don't Look Up. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that you do. 2.5 hours. Great acting cast. The reason I say that it's a horror film is that it's in the tagline that says some events that may actually be true, something like that. So the story of Don't Look Up begins when a graduate student working on her PhD in astronomy discovers that there's a comet on a collision course with the Earth. The comet is bigger than the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. So when it hits, Earth is gone. It's going to cause global extinction. So recognizing the urgency of her discovery, her major professor and she rushed to the White House to alert the president and her administration, and they are met with indifference and bureaucratic incompetence. The president, who is played by Meryl Streep, initially dismisses the threat because her political agenda and media appearances are much more important than scientific data. And as they try to spread the word about the impending disaster, the scientists face widespread skepticism and apathy from the public and the media because celebrity gossip and trivial news are more important. Some people become convinced because of misinformation about conspiracy theories. They dismiss the threat altogether. The official stance of Washington is, don't look up. The president and others say, if you look up, they only want to take your guns, infringe on your individual rights, and take away your medical care. Now, the film was made to critique the societal response to existing existential threats, real-world life issues like climate change and public health crises. But you can extend that to see it as a critique of the MAGA movement as, whether it was intended or not, lines encouraging people not to look up and see the inevitable impending doom are the same lines that have been filling our airwaves for weeks. The story highlights how misinformation can spread and how people often choose to ignore facts when the facts conflict with their beliefs or when their facts conflict with their self-interest. As it becomes clear that the disaster cannot be averted or avoided, the film showcases reactions from societies all over the world about how people deal with this. Some people choose to party, celebrate. Some succumb to panic and despair. But in the end, the comet strikes, leading to widespread devastation. The earth is doomed. Life all over the planet dies. Now, the reason I wanted to watch this happy film is for the penultimate closing. Actually, there are two closings, and if you watch it, you have to watch the penultimate closing and then the one that is even after the credits. That's pretty funny. But the penultimate closing scene of the movie, where a disparate group of people where relationships had been broken, trust betrayed, wounds delivered, as well as people who normally would have been excluded or not welcome, they all gather around a table for one final meal. And they are recalling memories, expressing regrets, making amends, forgiving, loving. It's just the community that this world needs right now. The table shakes as the earth is hit. The impending end is clearly in sight. But before they eat, the host of the meal says, we should have a blessing. Now, here's the thing. I found out by doing some research that this scene was not in the original script of the movie. It was ad-libbed. And the host said we should have a blessing, and the least likely character at the table offers one up spontaneously. It's not in the script. To me, it is the most beautiful moment in the film. So, this is what he prayed, and this is how I will end this teaching. Dearest Father and Almighty Creator, we ask for your grace tonight, despite our pride, your forgiveness despite our doubt. Most of all, Lord, we ask for your love to soothe us through these dark times. May we face whatever is to come in your divine will with courage and open hearts of acceptance. I hope you've heard all of this as a comforting word today, because Jesus is watching you. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, see you here next week.